Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well, and today we're going to be reading Chapter 7 and 8 of Not a Drop to Drink. Chapter 7. Lynn's war against the coyotes had caused a complication. Deer wouldn't venture within her range. After dropping her response to Stebbs at the rock, she tried to ignore the blooming hunger in her belly. Long months of vegetables for breakfast, lunch, and dinner lay before her. There was still a chance that she could hunt, take down a small deer sufficient for herself. If she wanted meat for the winter, she'd have to leave the roof. She lay prone, silently watching everything around her. Stebbs had not come for her note yet. Lynn bit her lip as she watched his red handkerchief moving through the woods as he went about his evening routine, as familiar to her as her own. Smoke bloomed to the east and the south, and Lynn looked at both pillars with suspicion. She had come to think of the people to the east as the Streamers, which was a nicer name than Mother had used when they kept burning green wood. The lone boot print at the edge of the pond strayed through her mind. It could have been a streamer, but what use would they have for her water? If it had been one of the men from the southern camp, she doubted he would have overlooked the chance to take the house while it was unguarded. Stebbs was not in doubt. Never in all her life had he approached her pond. The white smoke of the streamers dispersed into the evening sky, sending out a gray pall over the fields. There was no breeze, the smoke hung densely in the air. An evening fog rolled in from the west to join the haze, making the boulder stand out in stark contrast. As Lynn watched, a figure appeared beside it. She raised her binoculars to watch Stebbs. She thought she detected a laugh go through his shoulders as he read her note. He scribbled an answer on the same piece of paper. Lynn didn't dare venture out until morning. The fog that had formed was becoming thick, and she might get turned around in the night. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. There was a chill in the air, enough that she gathered up her rifle and descended the antenna. A night's uninterrupted rest would be welcome. If she couldn't see, they couldn't either. Lynn settled into her cot, oblivious to the complete darkness of the basement. When Mother had been alive, they would light the oil lamps and stay awake to talk, planning the next day's activities. Lynn needed no light to lie alone, wondering what the note waiting at the rock would say. Lynn could live on her own. The daily duties of survival were well within her capabilities, but she couldn't defend herself constantly. The pond was foremost in her mind, and she couldn't keep a watch over it while cutting wood in the fence row. Trips to the forest for larger loads of firewood were out of the question, as was any foraging of neighboring houses for the little things she would inevitably need. Stebbs suffered the opposite problem. His daily chores were a trial because of his lame leg. They would benefit from each other. He could watch the pond while she cut wood, and she would give him half in return. Water she would not part with. It seemed Stebbs wasn't in need of any, even though she never saw him hauling water to his shack from some unknown source. Her ankle was taking more weight easily, though she still wore the makeshift brace under her boot. She was able to walk, but the stench of coyotes choked her throat nearly shut as she made her way out to the boulder. Her shirt was tucked over her nose, and she had her nostrils pinched shut through it by the time she opened the note. It read, "There are people at the stream." She stared at it. She'd been expecting an offer of help, questions about Mother, or the burning of her outbuilding. Instead, it was a statement so obvious as to be nearly insulting. She was chewing on the end of the pin that she had brought, debating on an appropriate response when the man stood up from behind the boulder. Lynn's instincts were too finely honed to allow for screaming. The rifle that had been lashed across her back snapped to the front so quickly that she would find a burn between her shoulder blades from the strap that evening. He looked much different than she remembered. Years of watching Stebbs through the binoculars hadn't prepared Lynn for the reality of his person, his fine lines around his mouth, the brightness of his eyes, or the silver-streaked hair that peeked out from underneath his hat. She backpedaled, even though his arms were in the air and he had no weapon. The closeness of anyone other than Mother was so alien to Lynn that she had to smother the need to run away from its strangeness. "Lynn," he said calmly, "it's all right." She had never heard her name spoken by a man before. Even when he'd recuperated at their house, Mother had not allowed Lynn to be near him much. But his voice brought long-dead memories to the surface, the pleasant sound of his tones seeping through the floorboards above her head, murmured conversations not meant for her ears. His voice hadn't changed, but there was a calming note to it now, which her addled brain had a difficult time placing. There was a brief time as a child when a fever put Lynn in her cot for a week, and Mother's entire demeanor changed. She had barely ventured to the roof, even neglecting to collect water as the fever spiked. The lines around her eyes, harsh from years of squinting into the sun, had softened during those days in the basement, and her voice changed. The factual, clipped manner of her speech had dropped, to be replaced by a softer, more comforting tone. Lynn recognized the same elements in Stebb's voice. His muscles relaxed slightly, and she brought the barrel of the gun down, but ready to spring back to his center mass if necessary. Her throat, still constricted from the smell of rot, tightened further as she wondered what to say. Mother was the only person she could remember ever speaking to. "Why'd you surprise me like that?" Lynn asked. "I'm sorry." He came around to the front of the rock and sat on it, pulling his hat off his head and running his fingers through his hair. "Didn't think you'd come if you saw me here, and I didn't want to waste days writing if we could have a talk." Uh-huh. He reached for his inner jacket pocket, and Lynn's rifle snapped upward. "Whoa," he said in the same calming voice. "Just getting my hanky." She nodded for him to go ahead, and he did so, slowly, keeping an eye on her trigger finger. The red handkerchief appeared, and Lynn resisted the urge to reach out and touch it. It was the only element of the outside world that had ever spoken of hope. A flash of red in the woods that had assured her they were not the last people left. Stebb's was proof that not everyone would attack them for the sake of drinkable water while they slept. For 16 years, that splash of color had been her only proof of decency in the world. Up close, details sprang out at her. The hanky wasn't solid red, but decorated with a black and white paisley pattern. One edge was frayed away, and she could see awkward stitches in the splitting, brittle fabric where he had tried to prevent it from unraveling. She'd seen many exactly like it, in the farmhouse she raided across the countryside. In one house, there'd been an entire drawer filled with red like his, and also navy blue ones. No doubt he'd come across them too, yet he stuck stubbornly to his one, with its patched holes and dangling strands. The handkerchief, familiar and yet foreign, drove a spike of emotion through her heart so unexpected that her legs buckled underneath her and she crumpled to the ground. "I shot her." The words tore from her throat, a confession she'd not been allowed even in the solitude of the basement. "I killed Mother." He was beside her in a second, strong hands on each of her shoulders. His touch was not the shock she had expected. Her skin didn't recoil instantly, though years of being warned of the danger men posed had been ingrained in her. Instead, she leaned forward and put her head on his shoulder, relishing the feel of his jacket against her face. "I heard shots." His hand patted her back, awkward but soothing. "What happened?" "She's dead." Lynn pulled back from him, suddenly embarrassed at their closeness. "There were coyotes and I missed." He nodded that he understood, and patted her shoulder with one hand. A flicker of deep emotion passed beneath his eyes, but with a single blink it was gone. He swallowed once, hard, and rose to his feet. She wiped her eyes quickly dry, and he did the same. Stebbs cleared his throat and faced east. "There are people over to the stream," he said. "I know." Lynn clumsily rose, her ankle throbbing inside the tight boot. "Mother thought the streamers wouldn't last the winter. They're burning green wood." He grunted his agreement. "No shots from that direction. They don't have guns. They've stayed next to the water even though it's cold. I think they've got someone sick who can't be moved. Or they've got no way of hauling water," Lynn added, glad to be able to play a familiar game, even if it was with a new player. "So they weren't smart enough to bring a bucket." They shook their heads at the same time. "City people," they said in unison, and Lynn caught herself smiling, her face creasing into the familiar pattern before she was aware of it. Lynn jerked her head to the south. "Those men, they're bad news." Mother had used that phrase to describe the worst possible things in life. The haze of a hot summer morning meant storm clouds but no rain. Black, fuzzy caterpillars warning that the winter would be especially harsh. The tiny black droppings of mice scattered in their makeshift basement pantry. Bad news for sure," Stebbs said, shifting his weight off his twisted foot. "I heard them trying to take you girls down." "Didn't work," Lynn said stiffly. "No," he said, his voice trailing off in a wave of nuance that Lynn wasn't practiced enough to understand. The sound of his voice was unfamiliar to her ears, and only Mother's small actions, mimicked and perfected forms of communication, were translatable. Sorry. They stood in awkward silence for a few moments, sharing their dread of the black column of smoke to the south. "I don't know what to do about them," Stebbs said, and Lynn nodded her agreement. "They've got a decent-sized group," she said. "Mother picked off a few in the dark that one night." "Did she?" A smile skimmed across Stebbs' face as he continued to watch the south. He lowered himself slowly to the rock, resting his crooked foot at an odd angle. "What will you do if they come now?" "Shoot them for as long as I can." Stebbs nodded. Lynn's eyes trailed to his foot. Her plan, labor in exchange for guarding of the pond, seemed insulting with his mangled limbs stretched out in front of her. He didn't appear to be in need of anything from what she could see. His skin was tan, his color healthy, his arms heavily muscled. Making the offer would only make her seem weak. The deal balanced in her favor. After a few moments' rest, Stebbs propped himself on his good leg, jerking the other one underneath him as he rose. "You gonna be okay, kid?" Lynn kept her sight trained in the distance. "Yep," she said dismissively. "I'm fine. Mother didn't raise any idiots." "Didn't expect she would." Stebbs motioned toward the smoke of the streamer's pitiful fire. "After the smoke's gone for a few days, I'm going over there, see if they have anything useful." "Okay," Lynn said, surprised at his freedom to wander without worry. His little shack must hold nothing of value, and his source of water well hidden. She took a sideways glance at his injured foot. "It's a decent hike." "Yep. I could go," she offered hesitantly, "if you'd stay and watch over the pond." Lynn's rotated his twisted foot for a moment, considering. "You trust me to do that?" "You could have killed us at any time." Whether Mother had liked him or not, Stebbs had been a constant presence who never threatened them, even when their defenses were down. "You don't need our water." "No," he said, "I don't." Lynn nodded, letting the conversation drop there. To ask where he got his own would be the highest of betrayals in their world. "So 2 days, do you think?" "2 days of no smoke from the stream, and I'll come." "All right." They nodded stiffly and parted ways, each picking their path carefully through the bloated, rotting bodies of the coyotes. Okay, Chapter 8. "I can't go right now," Lynn argued, her arms bloody from the elbow down. A small deer carcass hung from the tree, a pile of organs and intestines underneath it. Stebbs looked critically at the jagged cut she'd made from clavicle to pubic bone. Mother's stronger, more confident slashes had looked much neater. Stebbs ignored her protest while he looked up at the tarp she'd rigged around some green saplings, teepee style. "You going to smoke it?" "That's the plan. The shed's gone, but that tarp should do the trick for now." "It'll draw attention. They already know I'm here." "Don't know you're alone," he countered. "If they send someone for a look and they don't see your mother, you'd be in a world of hurt." She ignored him while she skinned subcutaneous fat off the carcass. He made a good point, but she didn't want to admit that she'd made a mistake in shooting the deer too early to freeze the meat. "There's another way, you know," Stebbs said. "You can salt it, hang it in the trees to cure." "I don't have enough salt." "I do. I'll butcher this while you're gone. You split with me whatever the streamers had." Lynn didn't ask how he had enough salt that he could offer to preserve a whole deer for a neighbor. The process of rotting had begun the moment the heart stopped pumping, and already the flies were gathering at the folds of the wound she'd opened. "Go get your salt, then," she said stiffly. Walking away from the house felt like a crime, even though she trusted Stebbs. The familiar roof looked distinctly odd from a distance. The tilted angles of the second story at odds with the lightly sloping section over the kitchen where she and Mother had always camped. When it was blocked from view by trees, Lynn clamped down on the surge of betrayal that filled her gut. She pushed the ever-present worry of whether Mother would approve to the back of her mind, and she crossed the clover field she'd seen every day of her life but not set foot in once. She had tucked her hair under her stocking cap, a simple gender disguise that Mother had taught her, and the cool breeze brought goosebumps to her exposed neck. They prickled down her chest and the length of her arms. Autumn was gorgeous, with the leaves changing and falling, spinning to the ground to be crushed under her boots. But their death and downfall served as warning echoes to the other living things around them. The cold is coming. Be prepared. Lynn was confident the streamers were dead. Their meager green fires had sputtered, then stopped entirely. Anything in a weakened state would not have survived the past 2 nights without a fire. She kept her rifle in the crook of her elbow as she picked her way through the long grasses toward the stream. There was no doubt that the camp of men had also noticed the passing of the streamers. Buzzards wouldn't be the only scavengers picking over their campsite. In other circumstances, it would have been a pleasant walk. The countryside was resplendent with color, the sky a bright blue. The breeze shifted the grass around her, wafting into her face the faintly spicy scent of green leaves turning brown. But Lynn's eyes saw only usefulness in these small miracles. The fading greens and yellows allowed her brown overalls to blend nicely with the surroundings. The unclouded sky gave a little more warmth to the earth. The breeze shifting the grass covered the sounds of her movement. The slight fragrance from broken stalks masked her scent as she neared the stream. She approached the camp from downwind, studying the area around her for other intruders. A squirrel chattered angrily, and she dropped closer to the earth, aware that it was signaling distress. Lynn crept forward, ignoring the brambles that tugged at her as she moved. The squirrel was perched wearily on the opposite bank, rocked back on its haunches and regarding a straight line of acorns with suspicion. It chattered again, letting the whole woods know he was uneasy with the situation and unsure what to do about it. At the other end of the line of acorns was a little girl. Her arm was outstretched, palm up, beckoning the squirrel to come closer. She was filthy, her face streaked with grime except for 2 clean rivulets streaking from her mouth where she drank from the stream. Her tattered shoes sucked at the mud as she tried to lure the squirrel closer. The sharp corner of her elbow poked through the worn crease of her sleeve. The squirrel continued to chatter at the girl while taking hesitant steps closer, stuffing acorns into its mouth. Lynn spotted the streamer's campsite 30 yards downstream. Someone had dragged a fallen tree over to a live tree with a fork growing in it, propped the dead one into the notch, and stacked branches along the sides to provide some cover. It wasn't a bad idea, but they'd neglected to put any mud or leaves over the branches. It might provide the barest shelter from the wind, but rain would drip in constantly, and it would hold no heat. A pile of half-burnt sticks lay in front of the opening. No matter how badly it was made, the person who built it would have been much bigger than the child kneeling in the mud. Lynn kept her eyes on the shelter as she moved closer to the bank. Left on her own, the child would die, and soon. Even if she were successful luring squirrels, she had no way to cook meat and no source of heat. Even a stocked pantry wouldn't save her once the snow fell. She would die of exposure, leaving a small white skeleton to be carried away by the swollen spring river. That image caused Lynn to fire her rifle before she was aware she made a decision. The squirrel's chatter stopped instantly, its body blown sideways. The girl jerked to her feet, oblivious to the fine spray of blood that flecked her pale face. Lynn crossed the stream with the gun pointed forward, hoping the girl would realize she meant no harm. Or with the gun pointing downward. But the harm had already been done. When Lynn picked up her kill by the tail and presented it to the girl, her bottom lip shook. Cha-cha, her tiny voice barely escaped her mouth before evaporating in the cold afternoon air. You killed Cha-cha. The resounding wail that followed was much stronger, and Lynn dropped to her knees beside the child as tears started to spill forth. Stop! Lynn spun left and right, nervous that they would draw attention. Stop! Please stop! She put her hands on the tiny, sharp shoulders, alarmed at how near to the surface her bones were. I'm sorry. The blow came from above and to the right, knocking Lynn into the stream, her rifle spinning out of reach. She flailed wildly, gasping for air before she cleared the surface. A rush of cold water filled her lungs as she scrambled for the bank, where she wrenched it back out. She'd lost her hat. Cold, wet coils of hair hung in her face, and she wiped them away, searching for her attacker. Christ, said a male voice. It's a girl. He was standing in front of the child, his arms spread wide to shield her, a thick branch in one hand. Lynn clutched her midsection, still queasy from the feeling of water rushing into the dark internal corners of her body. Her gun was lying between them on the bank, but she made no move for it. Yes, she said, I'm a girl. She struggled to her feet, alarmed at the unsteadiness in her legs. He dropped his makeshift weapon and grabbed the child, pulling her in front of him. "Take her," he pleaded. "Take her with you." "What?" Lynn crossed her arms over her chest, shivering in her soaked clothing. The little girl recoiled, clutching at the boy and wailing incoherently. He pushed her toward Lynn, leaving small muddy ditches in the wake of her feet. "Take her," he repeated. "I can't. I don't know how." Lynn backpedaled away from his reaching arms and their struggling burden. Her unsteady legs folded underneath her, and she landed in a clumsy tangle of limbs and wet clothing. The child was shoved into her lap and instantly kicked her in the jaw. Lynn went over sideways, clutching her face. The boy lifted the girl in the air, shaking her with frustration. "You'll die," he screamed into her face. "You stay here with us and we'll all die." A slow, building groan filled the forest, a sound so odd that hackles rose on Lynn's neck as she dove for her gun. The boy didn't try to stop her. His arms went slack at the noise, and the little girl puddled to the ground at his feet. "Mama," she wailed, fresh tears cutting paths in the grime of her face. "Everything's okay," the boy shouted toward the makeshift shelter, and Lynn's grip on the rifle relaxed. "It's all right," he said again, voice quivering with the effort of yelling. "Lucy's fine. She's right here with me." The noise subsided, replaced by the small whimpering of the child kneeling in the mud. "Mama," she said again, peering anxiously at the tent. "Don't," the boy warned her. "You can't go over there." Lynn glanced at the little girl. "Is your mama sick?" She nodded vigorously in reply, but didn't speak. "I put her in there," the boy said. "I didn't know what else to do." "Is she yours?" Lynn asked, gesturing toward Lucy. "What? No, I'm only 16, he said by way of explanation. "She's like 7 years old." "I'm 5, came the disgruntled retort. "Is she yours?" Lynn tried again. "Your responsibility." "Oh, well, I guess they both are now," he said, fatigue filling every syllable. The little girl scuttled to his feet and perched there, eyeing Lynn distressfully. Lynn gingerly probed her head where the boy had hit her. A good-sized bump was forming there. It nearly filled the palm of her hand. "Sorry," he said. "I thought you were one of them coming back." "You've been attacked before?" He nodded. "Yeah, just the once, though. Not an attack, really. They just walked into my camp and took our food." Lynn's jaded gaze swept what he referred to as his camp, and she saw him bristle even though she held her tongue. "There wasn't anything I could do," he said. "They said they wouldn't hurt Lucy or Neva if I gave them our food." "Neva?" Lynn asked, curiosity spiked by the unfamiliar name. "Mama," came the answer, from the boy's feet. The girl, grown bored with the conversation, was drawing in the mud. "Mama's sick," she repeated when Lynn looked down at her. "I can't go in there," Eli said. "Eli's probably right," Lynn answered. "Those men, when was this?" He shrugged. "Neva wasn't in the tent yet, so maybe 3 weeks." "What have you been eating since?" "Not much. I caught a fish with my hands one day. We found some berries, and Lucy's been catching grasshoppers." His voice broke on the last word. Tears that she hadn't expected began streaming down his face, but he was past the point of embarrassment. "I told her they were to cheer up her mom, but—" He lost control again, a sob that shook his emaciated shoulders and racked his body and buckled his knees. His arms folded around the little girl protectively, but when he looked up at Lynn, there was steel in his voice. "You've got to take her." Lucy trudged along by her side, tripping when the long grasses snared her knees. She refused Lynn's offers of help, stolidly asserting that anyone who'd shot Cha-Cha didn't need to hold her hand. As the girl had gone to bid her mother goodbye, Lynn had quickly spitted the dead animal and hidden it behind a tree, explaining the process to Eli as she did so. He turned even paler at the sight of the sharpened stick emerging from Cha-Cha's throat, but didn't argue against eating him. As they approached the house, Lynn hailed the roof with one arm. She didn't want Stebbs to mistake her for someone else. There was an acknowledging movement from the house. Then she saw his dark form clumsily descending the antenna. Lynn glanced down at the little girl plodding alongside her. Weak as she was, a grim determination made her keep pace. Lucy had argued, fought, pleaded, and eventually thrown rocks at Eli when he insisted that she was leaving the stream. He'd taken her aside and assured her that she could return once her mom was better. although the fleeting glance he'd shot at Lynn told her how long those odds were. Eli wasn't trained to survive and had even less experience tending the sick. The grasses shifted in the wind as Stubbs made his way toward them, rifle slung across his shoulder. Any surprise he felt at seeing Lucy was well masked. "Hi there, little one," he said. He bent down on one knee to talk to her, even though the posture was difficult for him with his twisted leg. "How are we supposed to split you, I wonder?" Whatever animal magnetism the man had used on Lynn worked on Lucy as well. She ran forward and pitched herself into his arms, nuzzling her face against his old coat as if she'd known him forever. She pulled back, pointing a stiff finger at Lynn. "She's a bad girl. She shot Cha-Cha." Stubbs' brow furrowed in confusion. "She shot who now?" "There wasn't anything there for me to bring back," Lynn said for the third time as the trio huddled closer to the stove, eating their supper. "So you've said," Stubbs said, shoving a forkful of beans in his mouth. "I just don't want you to think, that you stashed stuff in the woods and we'll get it later, when you don't have to split it." "Yeah, that exactly," Lynn said into her plate, face blazing. "I wouldn't do that." Stubbs nodded and turned his attention to Lucy, who was eating from 2 jars at the same time. "Cut her off. She wasn't starving, but she was close. She eats too much right away, it'll kill her." "I know," Lynn said, stabbing a green bean with undue force. "So the others at the stream, you said there was a boy and a woman?" "Yeah, Eli he said his name was, and the woman, I forget. Something weird." "Neva," the little girl piped up. "Mama's name is Neva. It's pretty, not weird." Stubbs and Lynn shared a glance. After that, they ate in silence, the sound of their forks dinging against the sides of their jars, the only sound in the basement. The fire in the little cook stove was cracking unpleasantly, and Lucy began to nod off. Or cracking pleasantly, and Lucy began to nod off. Her head tipped to one side and came to rest on Stubbs' shoulder. "She's done in," he said, gently taking her food and fork away. "Wouldn't have lasted much longer." "Yeah, I know," Lynn grunted, pretending to search for the last bits of beans stuck to the sides of her jar. "You done the right thing, bringing her back. What else was I going to do?" Stubbs' face became serious as he looked down at the little head nestled against him. "There's always options. The mother won't last long. What is it, do you think?" "Don't know," Lynn answered. "The boy wouldn't let the little one here close to the tent. They both drank from the stream, so I wouldn't be surprised if it was cholera. I never got a look at her, and I wasn't interested." "Mama's sick," Lucy mumbled. "Baby won't come out." Lynn and Stubbs exchanged glances. "Baby?" he asked. "Your mom is pregnant?" Lucy nodded sleepily. "Eli wouldn't let me see her. He said the baby might come out, and it would be yucky." "That's one word for it," Stubbs said, gently urging Lucy's head off his shoulder. "Come on now, little one. Time for bed." "A real bed?" Lucy asked as Stubbs cradled her tiny frame in his arms. "With a pillow and everything?" "A pillow and everything," he promised, and laid her down on Lynn's cot. She burrowed under the blankets, curling her knees up to her chest. Lynn tried not to grimace at the sight of her filthy head resting on the clean pillowcase. "Think she's got lice?" "Lice and fleas, too, I wouldn't doubt," Stubbs said, motioning for Lynn to follow him up the stairs. "You want to boil those sheets in the morning, and get her a hot bath, first thing." They emerged into the cold night, the stark brilliance of the stars shining down on them. The air was so cold, the stars so clear, that Lynn could make out the shape of the last leaves clinging to the maple branches. Larger shapes hung among the limbs as well. "The venison?" she asked, jerking her chin toward them. Stubbs nodded. "Leave it there about a month or so. I'll come help when it's time to take it down, take my share. Nothing much should bother it up there. A squirrel or two, maybe. I understand you're not too partial to those." "I didn't know it was her pet," Lynn shot back. Stubbs sighed and looked up at the brilliance of the night sky. "Your mom taught you a lot, but she should have taught you what she didn't know, like how to make a joke." "I'll laugh when something's funny," she retorted, sinking down to sit on the ground. "And right now, that's not a lot. My provisions are back to feeding, too." "I'll help, and I owe you for my supper tonight." "No," Lynn said. "Bringing her back was my decision, and our deal was to split whatever I got from the camp in return for you butchering my deer. You did your half, and all I brought back was more work." "Maybe," Stubbs answered, "but the deal was to split what you found. I'll help with the girl." There was silence between them for a moment while a strange feeling bloomed inside Lynn's chest. Something else Mother had never taught her. Gratitude. Now, Stubbs said, what to do about the boy and the mother? I've got my share of work, Lynn said, and then some. Stubbs lowered himself to sit beside her, an action both clumsy and endearing. Maybe so, but if they get back on their feet, the girl won't be your problem anymore. Lynn shook her head. They're sunk. The boy was in worse shape than the little girl. I'm guessing he's been giving most of the food to her and the woman. Who was eating for two, Stubbs reminded her. Like I said, sunk. Another silence settled over them, this one permeated with the knowledge that an argument was about to begin. I won't leave them there to die, Stubbs said. You were happy enough to last week. It's different now. That little girl has a family. We were able to stop her from being orphaned. Wouldn't you want someone to take a chance if it meant you could have your mother back? A long pause followed. Lynn dug her fingers into the cold ground at her feet and watched Stubbs from the corner of her eye. He was absolutely still, but she could feel his steely blue gaze. Those people wandered out here unprepared. They invited their own fate. The only person to blame for what happened to Mother is me. She stood up, wiping the cold dirt from her hands. She offered him a palm. He took it, and she jerked him to his feet roughly, forcing all of his weight onto his bad leg. Stubbs grabbed at her for support, and she dug her free hand into his upper arm. We'll help them, she said, but you don't ever talk to me about Mother again unless I ask. He nodded his agreement, and she released his arm. He stumbled away from her, rubbing where her iron grip had been. It's the right thing to do, just like bringing Lucy back here was. I'll go with you tomorrow night, after she's asleep, Lynn continued as if Stubbs hadn't spoken. The boy knows me, at least. If you walk in there, he might hit you over the head with a rock. Wouldn't want that. Tomorrow night, Stubbs agreed, and melted into the darkness. I think we're in danger of becoming friends, his voice echoed back. The girl was deeply asleep when Lynn returned to the basement, and she didn't have the heart to wake her. Stubbs had unknowingly put Lucy in Lynn's own bed, so she laid down in Mother's cot, surprised at the waft of scent that enveloped her as she slid under the blankets. Mother's smell was there, the outline of her body still imprinted on the mattress. Lynn fit into it nicely, and watched over Lucy while she slept.